When the 12th stroke of the clock echoed through Ravenhurst Manor, silence followed, and with it the death of time itself. Sir Alistair Ravenshaw lay sprawled across his workshop floor, his fingers still clutching the golden pendulum of his masterwork, a clock that had never before kept perfect time. His lips, blue with poison, had whispered his final prophecy to the gathering crowd. The 12th stroke is for me alone, but he was wrong. It was for all of them. You're watching The Mystery Ledger, where every enigma leaves a trace. 3 hours earlier, the world had been alive. The winter of 1894 had descended upon England with uncommon cruelty. Snow fell in heavy curtains across the countryside, blanketing the roads and sealing the great estates in white tombs of ice. And nowhere was the cold more absolute than at Ravenhurst Manor, the ancestral home of Sir Alistair Ravenshaw, master clockmaker, recluse, and collector of sorrows. The manor stood like a monument to bygone grandeur, its Gothic spires clawing at the gray sky. Inside, the warmth of 100 candles did little to dispel the chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Tonight was New Year's Eve, and Sir Alistair had done something he had not done in 12 years. He had invited guests. Dr. John Watson stood in the grand entrance hall, his breath misting in the frigid air. He adjusted his collar and glanced toward his companion, a tall, lean figure whose sharp eyes surveyed the room with the intensity of a hawk. I confess, Holmes, I did not expect to spend the final night of the year in such melancholic surroundings, nor did I expect the invitation, Watson. Sir Alistair and I have had no correspondence in 15 years, not since I assisted him in recovering a stolen chronometer. That he should summon me now on this particular night suggests something more than nostalgia. Holmes' gaze drifted to the center of the hall, where a towering grandfather clock stood sentinel. Its face was exquisite, adorned with Roman numerals in gold leaf, the hands poised at 9:30. Yet something about it was wrong. The mechanism was silent. The pendulum hung still, a clock that does not tick. How very fitting. The other guests had already assembled in the drawing room, a gallery of strangers bound by secrets they did not yet know they shared. There was Lady Eveline Ashcroft, a widow draped in black silk, her beauty marred by a hardness around the eyes. Beside her stood Mr. Nathaniel Crowe, a portrait artist whose hands trembled as he sipped his brandy. Miss Claudia Wren, a governess with a nervous disposition, sat near the fire, her gaze fixed on the flames. And in the corner, smoking a cigar with deliberate calm, was Colonel Marcus Hargrave, a man whose military bearing could not quite conceal the watchfulness of a predator. They were an odd assembly, Holmes remarked. None seemed to know why they had been summoned, and none seemed entirely pleased to be there. At precisely 10 o'clock, the double doors opened and Sir Alistair Ravenshaw entered. He was a man of 60, gaunt and gray, with eyes that burned with feverish intensity. In his hands he carried a wooden box lacquered black and sealed with wax. Forgive my tardiness, time has become a difficult master. He moved to the center of the room and placed the box upon the table. You wonder why I have brought you here. Each of you holds a piece of a puzzle that will be completed at midnight. When the clock strikes 12, the truth will be revealed. Until then, he smiled, a terrible, haunted smile, you are my prisoners. The storm has seen to that. Prisoners? What absurdity is this? No absurdity, Lady Ashcroft, only justice. Justice that has waited 12 years. And with that, he turned and walked toward his workshop, the box still clutched in his skeletal hands. The guests exchanged glances, confusion, fear, and something darker. Holmes rose smoothly from his chair. Watson, I suggest we follow our host. I have the distinct impression that this evening will not end as he intends. They found Sir Alistair in his workshop, a chamber filled with the brass and silver skeletons of 1,000 timepieces. He stood before his greatest creation, the grandfather clock from the hall, now reassembled here, its pendulum swinging with hypnotic precision. You always were perceptive. Mr. Holmes? Yes, I summoned you because I knew that tonight one of them would try to silence me. and yet you invited them regardless. Because I am already a dead man, Mr. Holmes, the physicians give me weeks, perhaps days, but I will not die in my bed. I will die as I have lived by the clock. And when the 12th stroke sounds, he opened the black box. Inside lay a vial of clear liquid and a folded piece of paper. Thus, the 12th stroke is for me alone. Sir Alister, what are you— But the old man had already turned away. Closing the box with a decisive snap, Holmes watched him carefully, his mind already cataloging every detail. The tremor in Alister's hands, the faint smell of almonds that clung to the workshop air. The way the clock's pendulum swung, just slightly too fast. Something was very wrong, and in 2 hours, Sir Alister Ravenshaw would be dead. But the question that would haunt Ravenhurst Manor was not how he died, but whether he had chosen his own fate, or whether someone else had chosen it for him. The clock continued its relentless march toward midnight. Each tick a heartbeat, each talk a countdown to revelation. And in the drawing room below, 5 guests sat in uneasy silence, each nursing their own secrets, each waiting for the 12th stroke that would expose them all. Section 2. The gathering storm Holmes and Watson returned to the drawing room to find the atmosphere had grown considerably more tense. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the faces of the assembled guests. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded beast, hurling snow against the windows with increasing fury. Lady Eveline stood by the window, her reflection pale and ghostly in the dark glass. She turned as they entered, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Mr. Holmes, isn't it? I've heard of you. They say you see things others cannot." "I observe what is present, Lady Ashcroft. Others merely choose not to look." She smiled, a cold, calculated expression. "Then perhaps you can observe your way out of this dreadful situation. Our host has trapped us here with his melodramatic games, and I have no intention of playing along. I'm afraid the storm has trapped us far more effectively than Sir Alister ever could," Watson interjected, gesturing toward the window. "The roads will be impassable by now." Mr. Nathaniel Crowe set down his brandy glass with a sharp clink. His hands, Watson noted, had not stopped trembling. 12 years, he said. "What could have happened 12 years ago that concerns us? I was barely established as an artist then. I'd never even heard of Sir Alister Ravenshaw." "And yet he invited you specifically," Holmes observed, his keen eyes studying the artist's face. "Tell me, Mr. Crowe, what is the nature of your artistic specialty?" "Portraits, primarily. Though I've done some landscape work." "Portraits of whom?" Crowe's jaw tightened. "Various clients. The wealthy and prominent, mostly." "I don't see how that's relevant." "Everything is relevant when a man announces his own death." Holmes moved to the mantelpiece, his fingers trailing along the marble surface. "Miss Wren, you've been remarkably quiet. What brings a governess to such an unusual gathering?" Miss Claudia Wren looked up from the fire, her pale face drawn and anxious. I received a letter from Sir Alister. He said he had information about my previous employment, about what happened to the family I served, and what did happen to them. They died in a fire. 12 years ago," her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "The children I cared for, they burned." A heavy silence fell over the room. Even the colonel, who had been affecting an air of bored detachment, sat forward slightly, his eyes alert. "How very convenient," Lady Eveline said coldly. "We all seem to have connections to events from 12 years past. Surely you see the pattern, Mr. Holmes." "I see several patterns, Lady Ashcroft. The question is which one leads to truth and which to obfuscation." Holmes turned to face the colonel. "Colonel Hargrave, you've been remarkably silent. A military man, I perceive. Afghan campaign, judging by the slight limp you favor in damp weather. But you left the service some years ago, did you not?" The colonel's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, respect perhaps, or wariness. 13 years. Mr. Holmes, a training accident forced my retirement. How unfortunate. And what occupies your time now? Private security consultations, advising wealthy men on how to protect their interests. And did Sir Alister require your services? He contacted me 6 months ago. Claimed someone was trying to kill him. I conducted an assessment of his property and security measures. This caught Watson's attention. And what did you conclude? That Sir Alister was paranoid. but not without reason. Someone had been in his workshop. Items had been moved, locks tampered with, but I found no evidence of who or why. Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. Fascinating. So our host has been expecting his murder for quite some time. That rather suggests... He was interrupted by a scream. It came from above, a woman's voice, shrill with terror. The guests leapt to their feet as one, and Holmes was already moving toward the door before the echo had faded. They raced up the grand staircase, following the sound to the second-floor corridor. A maid stood trembling outside one of the guest rooms, her face white as chalk. "What is it?" Watson demanded, his medical instincts taking over. "What's happened?" The maid could only point toward the open door. Holmes entered first, Watson close behind. The room was opulent but cold, the curtains drawn back to reveal the raging storm outside. And there, laid out carefully on the bed, was a dress, a woman's gown in deep crimson silk, arranged as if someone invisible were wearing it. But it was what lay upon the dress that froze their blood. A single gear, golden and intricate, engraved with the Roman numeral Omedi Fees and pinned to the bodice. A card inscribed in elegant script. "The first stroke has fallen. 11 remain." Holmes moved closer, his face intense with concentration. He examined the gear without touching it, noting every detail. The weight of the gold, the precision of the engraving, the faint oil stains on its teeth. This was removed from a clock mechanism recently. "See how the oil hasn't yet dried? And the inscription..." He turned to the terrified maid. "Whose room is this?" Lady Ashcroft's, sir." They turned as one to find the lady herself standing in the doorway, her face drained of all color. For the first time that evening, her composure had shattered completely. "That dress," she whispered. "I haven't seen it in 12 years. I burned it." "I know I burned it. Why would you burn a dress, Lady Ashcroft?" Holmes asked softly, dangerously. She swayed slightly, and Watson moved to steady her. When she spoke, her voice was hollow. "Because it was the dress I wore the night my husband died." The night of the Ashford factory fire. The room seemed to grow colder. Holmes' eyes narrowed. The Ashford factory. Where, pray tell, was this factory located? In Manchester. It was a clockworks facility. My husband owned it with 2 partners. They manufactured timepieces and mechanical components. And the fire? It started just before midnight on New Year's Eve, 1882. 12 years ago, her voice cracked. 37 people died, Mr. Holmes. Workers who'd stayed late to complete an important order. They were trapped when the building collapsed. Among them, she couldn't finish, but she didn't need to. Holmes turned back to the dress, his mind racing through possibilities and connections. Watson could practically see the calculations forming behind those piercing eyes. "The children," Miss Wren breathed from the doorway where the other guests had gathered. "The family I worked for, the Hargroves. Mr. Hargrove was an engineer at the Ashford factory. He died in that fire. 6 months later, his wife went mad with grief and set fire to their home with herself and the children inside. And my first major commission," Crow added, his voice shaking, "was painting a memorial portrait of the victims. I spent weeks interviewing survivors, families of the dead. It nearly destroyed me." All eyes turned to Colonel Hargrave. "I wasn't a colonel then," he said quietly. "I was Captain Hargrave, military liaison to the factory. They were manufacturing timing mechanisms for artillery shells. The fire destroyed months of work and several experimental prototypes. The inquiry blamed faulty wiring, but..." He hesitated. "There were rumors, sabotage, a disgruntled employee." Holmes stood perfectly still, his mind assembling the pieces. "And Sir Alister Ravenshaw was the third partner," Lady Eveline said bitterly. "Along with my late husband and Thomas Ashford. After the fire, the business collapsed. Ashford drank himself to death within a year. My husband followed 6 months later. The physicians called it heart failure, but I knew better. It was guilt that killed him. And Sir Alister? Sir Alister withdrew from society entirely. He's been alone in this manner ever since." "Alone with his clocks," Holmes murmured. "Alone with his guilt, and alone with his revenge." Watson frowned. "But Holmes, if Sir Alister is seeking revenge against those connected to the fire, why would he announce his own death? Why give his enemies, if that's what they are, any warning at all?" Holmes' expression was grim. "Because, Watson, Sir Alistair Ravenshaw is not the hunter in this scenario. He is merely the messenger. Someone else has been orchestrating this gathering, and Sir Alistair knew it. That is why he summoned me. Not to prevent his death, but to solve his murder. A clock somewhere in the house began to chime. 10 tolls, each one resonating through the halls like a death knell. 10 o'clock had passed, 2 hours remained until midnight, and as the final chime faded into silence, every light in Ravenhurst Manor went out at once, plunging them all into absolute darkness. In the blackness, someone screamed. The darkness was total, suffocating. Watson fumbled for his matches, his heart hammering against his ribs. Around him, voices rose in panic and confusion. "Stay calm!" Holmes' voice cut through the chaos with commanding authority. "No one move. Watson, do you have your matches?" "Yes, just a moment." A flare of sulfur and a small flame bloomed in Watson's hand. The flickering light revealed faces frozen in fear, Lady Eveline clutching the doorframe, Crow backing against the wall, Miss Wren with her hands pressed to her mouth. Colonel Hargrave had drawn what appeared to be a small pistol from his coat. "Unnecessary, Colonel," Holmes said sharply. "Put that away before someone gets hurt." "Someone's already been hurt," the colonel replied, but he lowered the weapon. "That scream came from downstairs," Holmes interrupted. He took the candle that the maid had managed to light with Watson's match. "Everyone stay together. We go down as a group." They descended the staircase in a tight cluster, their shadows monstrous on the walls. The wind shrieked outside, rattling the windows. The manor felt alive with menace, every creak and groan a potential threat. The entrance hall was empty, but the drawing-room door stood ajar. Holmes approached cautiously, the candlelight barely penetrating the gloom beyond. Inside, they found the room in disarray. Chairs overturned, papers scattered across the floor. And in the center of it all, Sir Alistair's black lacquered box lay open and empty. The vial was gone. So was the folded paper. "Good God," Watson breathed. "Someone's taken the poison." "Not someone, Watson. Our host himself. Look." Holmes pointed to a trail of disturbed dust, leading toward the corridor that connected to the workshop. "He came through here in haste. The question is whether he came of his own volition or was pursued. Should we follow him?" Holmes hesitated, something that Watson had rarely seen him do. "No, not yet. First, we need light and we need information. Colonel, you mentioned that Sir Alistair's electrical system had been professionally installed. Where is the generator?" "In the cellar." "But it's been temperamental. Sir Alistair complained about it constantly." "Temperamental or sabotaged?" The colonel's jaw tightened. "If you're implying that I'm implying nothing yet, Colonel. I'm simply gathering facts. Lady Ashcroft, you were married to Sir Alistair's business partner. Did you know this house well?" "I visited here occasionally before the fire, before everything fell apart." "Then you know there's a servant's passage that runs behind these walls. I noticed the telltale door during our tour earlier. Miss Wren, when you arrived this evening, did you see anyone else in the house besides Sir Alistair and his staff?" The governess shook her head, her eyes wide in the candlelight. "No one? Just the butler who took my coat and the maid." The house felt empty, like a tomb with very much alive occupants, Holmes murmured. He crossed to the fireplace and knelt, examining something on the hearth. When he stood, he held a small scrap of paper, partially burned. "Watson, your light, please." Together they studied the fragment. Only a few words were legible, written in the same elegant script as the card upstairs. "Cannot escape what you have done. The 12th stroke. Justice for the innocent." "A threatening letter," Watson concluded. "Or a confession," Holmes countered. "Note the phrasing. What you have done, not what you will face or what awaits you." This was written by someone who sees themselves as an agent of justice, not merely revenge. A sudden crash from somewhere above made them all jump. It sounded like breaking glass. "The bedrooms," Crow gasped. "Someone's in the bedrooms." Holmes was already moving, taking the stairs 2 at a time. The others followed, their collective fear driving them forward despite the danger. They reached the 2nd floor to find a window, at the far end of the corridor, shattered. Snow and wind howling through the jagged opening. But it was the door beside the broken window that held Holmes' attention. It stood slightly ajar, and from within came a faint rhythmic sound. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Holmes pushed the door open fully. The room beyond was unlike anything Watson had seen in the manor thus far. Every surface was covered with clocks, wall clocks, mantel clocks, pocket watches hanging from strings like grotesque ornaments. And in the center, on a simple wooden desk, sat an ancient clock mechanism, its gears exposed and moving with hypnotic precision. "Sir Alister's private study," Lady Evelyn whispered. I'd forgotten about this room. He used to spend hours here, working on his designs. Holmes moved to the desk, his eyes scanning the papers scattered across its surface. Technical drawings, mathematical equations, and page after page of handwritten notes. He lifted one sheet, his expression growing more intent with each line he read. "Watson, look at this date. December 31st, 1882. This is Sir Alister's journal entry from the night of the fire." He read aloud, his voice steady but grim. The demonstration was scheduled for midnight. "I argued against it," told Ashford, and Evelyn's husband, that it was too dangerous, that the new timing mechanism hadn't been properly tested. But they wouldn't listen. The military contract was worth too much, they said. Colonel Hargrave himself was coming to witness the test. I should have stopped them. I should have pulled the workers from the building. But I was a coward. I wanted the success as much as they did, and I told myself that my concerns were merely excessive caution. Now, they're dead. 37 souls burned and crushed, and I am alive to bear witness to my own moral failure. The 12th stroke of midnight rang out just as the fire began. I heard it from my carriage as I fled. 12 chimes, and with each one, a life snuffed out. I will never escape that sound. It follows me into sleep and wakes me in darkness. The 12th stroke is my burden to carry until death releases me. Silence fell over the room, broken only by the relentless ticking of 100 clocks. He blamed himself, Miss Wren said softly. All these years he blamed himself, but someone else blames him more, Holmes replied. He picked up another paper, a recent letter, judged by the crisp quality of the paper and the fresh ink. This arrived 3 months ago, according to the date. Listen, Sir Alister, you cannot hide behind your guilt forever. You knew the mechanism was flawed. You knew the building was unsafe. Yet you said nothing while 37 people worked through the night, unaware that they were building the instrument of their own deaths. You are as guilty as your partners, more so because you had the knowledge to prevent it and chose profit over humanity. The 12th stroke is coming for you, and this time you will not escape. Who sent it? Watson demanded, unsigned, but posted from London. Holmes set the letter down and turned to face the assembled group. Someone connected to the fire has been planning this for months. They arranged for Sir Alister to gather you all here, his former associates, people whose lives were destroyed by that tragedy. They wanted witnesses, wanted you to see him face justice. But who? Crow's voice cracked. Who could orchestrate all this? Holmes's eyes glittered in the candlelight. Someone who has access to this house. Someone who knows its secrets and its rhythms. Someone who... A door slammed somewhere below them. Then footsteps, running desperately. And then, rising above the howl of the wind, a voice, Sir Alister's voice, screaming in mortal terror. No! Stay back! The clock is wrong. The words ended in a horrible, gurgling choke. Holmes sprinted from the room, the others streaming behind him. They raced down the stairs and through the corridor to the workshop door. Holmes threw it open. Sir Alister Ravenshaw knelt before his great-grandfather clock, his hands clutching at his throat. His face had turned a mottled purple blue, his eyes bulging with the unmistakable signs of cyanide poisoning. The vial lay shattered on the floor beside him. Its contents spilled across the wooden boards. Watson rushed forward, his medical training overriding his shock. But even as he reached the dying man, he knew it was too late. Cyanide acted within minutes, and Sir Alister had clearly ingested a massive dose. Holmes, Watson said urgently, there's nothing I can do. Sir Alister's hand shot out, grabbing Holmes' sleeve with desperate strength. His lips moved, forming words that came out as barely a whisper. Holmes leaned close, his ear nearly touching the dying man's mouth. Whatever Sir Alister said, it was for Holmes alone. Then his hand fell away. His eyes glazed. and he collapsed forward onto the floor. The grandfather clock behind him struck 11. 1 hour remained until midnight. Watson closed Sir Alister's staring eyes, his own heart heavy with the weight of another death he could not prevent. When he looked up, Holmes stood perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask. What did he say? Lady Evelyn demanded. What were his final words? Holmes turned to face them all, and something in his expression made Watson's blood run cold. This was Holmes in his most dangerous mode, the hunter who had caught the scent of his prey. He said, "The clock lies. The 12th stroke already passed, and the killer is already dead." The assembled guests stared at him in confusion and horror. "What does that mean?" Miss Wren whispered. "How can the killer be dead?" Holmes's smile was thin and sharp as a blade. "That, Miss Wren, is precisely what we must determine in the next 60 minutes. Because whoever orchestrated Sir Alister's death is still in this house. And unless I am very much mistaken, they have no intention of letting any of us leave alive." The workshop had become a tomb. Sir Alister's body lay where it had fallen, a testament to the precision of murder. Holmes had forbidden anyone to move him until a full examination could be conducted. Though with the storm still raging and the roads impassable, no official authorities would arrive before morning at the earliest. Watson knelt beside the corpse, his physician's eyes cataloging the evidence of death, the blue tinge to the lips and fingernails, the faint odor of bitter almonds, the contorted expression frozen on the dead man's face. All pointed to cyanide poisoning, just as they had expected, but something troubled him. "Holmes, look at his hands." Holmes crouched beside him, his sharp eyes following Watson's gesture. Sir Alister's right hand was clenched in a fist, but his left lay open, palm upward. In the center of the palm, barely visible against the pale skin, was a mark, a small burn, circular and precise. "Recent," Holmes murmured, examining it without touching. "Within the last few hours. See how the flesh is still inflamed? This wasn't from handling the vial. The shape is too regular, too deliberate. Could it be from one of his tools? A clockmaker's accident? Possibly. Or possibly a message. Colonel Hargrave, bring that candle closer, if you please." The colonel stepped forward, his face grim. In the increased light, the burn mark became clearer. It wasn't merely circular. It had a pattern etched within it. Numbers, Roman numerals. "The 12th stroke," Lady Eveline breathed. "It's branded on him." "Not branded," Holmes corrected. "Burned with something small and heated. A seal, perhaps? Or a stamping die? Something that could be heated over a flame and pressed to skin." He stood, his gaze sweeping the workshop. "The question is when this was done. Was Sir Alister marked before he drank the poison, or after?" "Does it matter?" Crowe asked, his voice shaking. "The man is dead either way." "It matters enormously, Mr. Crowe. It determines whether Sir Alister was attacked by someone else, or whether he marked himself as part of some ritual suicide. Given his cryptic final words, I'm inclined to believe a sound from the corridor made them all freeze. Footsteps, slow and measured, approaching the workshop. Holmes moved to the doorway in one fluid motion, positioning himself to see who approached, while remaining partially concealed. Watson rose to stand beside him, wishing he had thought to bring his service revolver. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was the butler, a thin, elderly man whom Watson had barely noticed during their arrival. He carried a silver tray bearing a single envelope. "Forgive the interruption, Mr. Holmes," the butler said, his voice tremulous, "but this was discovered in the entrance hall just moments ago." "It bears your name." Holmes took the envelope, examining it with keen interest. It was made of expensive paper, sealed with black wax, impressed with, unsurprisingly, the Roman numeral Bomthene. He broke the seal and withdrew a single card. As he read, his expression darkened. "What does it say?" Watson asked quietly. Holmes handed him the card. The message was brief and chilling. "Mr. Holmes, by now you have discovered the first death, but the night is not yet over. At the 11th hour, the second stroke will fall. At midnight, the truth will be revealed, and the guilty will face their judgment. You cannot stop what has already been set in motion. The clock has been counting down for 12 years. Signed, a ghost of the Ashford fire. A ghost, Miss Wren whispered, her face ashen. One of the victims. Impossible, Colonel Hargrave snapped. Everyone who was in that building died. The bodies were all accounted for, were they? Holmes turned to the butler, who still stood in the doorway, wringing his hands nervously. You've been in Sir Alister's employ for how long? 15 years, sir. Since before the tragedy. Then you knew him well. Did he ever speak of the fire? Of survivors who might have borne him ill will? The butler's face creased with sorrow. He spoke of little else, sir. The fire consumed him more surely than it consumed those poor souls. He kept records, you see, journals filled with the names of the dead, their families, their stories. He tried to help them, sent money anonymously, arranged for the children to be educated. But he could never forgive himself. And did anyone ever refuse his help? Anyone who might have wanted more than money, who might have wanted revenge. The butler hesitated, glancing nervously at the assembled guests. There was one. A man who came here 5 years ago, claiming to be the brother of one of the workers who died. He demanded to see Sir Alister, said he knew the truth about the fire. The master refused to see him, had me turn him away. But the man? He stood outside the gates for 3 days, in all weather, just watching the house. Then he vanished. We never saw him again. Did this man give a name? He did, sir. He called himself Thomas Ashford, Lady Eveline gasped. But that's impossible. Thomas Ashford was one of the factory owners. He drank himself to death within a year of the fire. I attended his funeral myself. Then either you were mistaken about his death, Holmes said slowly, or someone has assumed his identity for purposes of their own. Tell me, Lady Ashcroft, did Thomas Ashford have any family? Brothers, sons? She shook her head. He was unmarried, childless. His only relation was an elderly mother who passed away shortly after he did. The Ashford line died with them. Holmes paced the workshop, his mind visibly working through the puzzle. Watson knew that look. His friend was assembling pieces that the rest of them couldn't yet see. The butler said, this man appeared 5 years ago. Sir Alister began receiving threatening letters 3 months ago, according to his journal. And 6 months ago he contacted Colonel Hargrave about security concerns. Holmes stopped pacing, turning to face them all. Whatever triggered this sequence of events happened approximately 6 months ago. Something changed, something that made Sir Alister realize his life was in genuine danger. His diagnosis, Watson said suddenly. He told us the physicians gave him weeks, perhaps days. A terminal illness. He must have learned of it 6 months ago. Precisely, Watson. And upon learning he was dying, Sir Alister made preparations. He hired the colonel to assess his security. He began sorting through his affairs, and he planned this gathering, not to seek revenge, but to expose the person who had been tormenting him. By dying in front of us? Crow's voice rose with hysteria. What kind of plan is that? A desperate one, but also a clever one. Sir Alister knew he couldn't prevent his own death. His illness would claim him regardless. So he chose to control the circumstances of his end. He invited everyone connected to the Ashford factory fire, knowing that his killer would have to reveal themselves to complete their revenge. And he invited you, Mr. Holmes, Lady Eveline added, her sharp mind catching up, to ensure that when the killer struck, there would be a witness capable of understanding what had happened. Just so. Sir Alister transformed his own death into an elaborate puzzle, one designed to... The grandfather clock suddenly lurched into motion with a grinding screech of metal. Its hands, which had been stuck at 9:30, began spinning wildly backward, the mechanism clearly broken. Gears ground and shrieked. Then, with a sound like a gunshot, something inside the clock exploded. The glass face shattered outward. Everyone threw up their arms to shield themselves from the flying shards. When they lowered them, they saw that the clock's interior was exposed, its mechanisms visible, and wedged among the gears was a human hand. Watson felt his stomach turn. The hand was fresh, still bearing the warmth of recent life. It had been severed cleanly at the wrist, and on one finger glinted a gold ring. Miss Wren screamed and collapsed. Colonel Hargrave caught her before she hit the floor. Lady Eveline stood frozen, her face bone white. Only Crow moved closer, his artist's eye drawn despite his horror. "That ring," he whispered. "I know that ring. I painted it. It belonged to—" He couldn't finish. He didn't need to. Holmes carefully extracted the severed hand from the clock mechanism, examining it with clinical detachment. Watson forced himself to assist, his medical training overriding his revulsion. "Male," Watson noted. "Young, judging by the skin texture. The amputation was done post-mortem. See how little blood there is? This person died elsewhere, and the hand was removed and placed here as a message, or as a clue," Holmes added. He studied the ring closely. It was gold, heavy, with an ornate crest engraved on its face. "This is a signet ring, quite old. The crest is—" He paused, his eyes narrowing. "This is the Ashford family crest." The room spun for Watson. None of this made sense. The Ashford line was extinct. There were no male Ashfords left to bear such a ring. "Unless," Holmes continued, his voice taking on that dangerous edge again, "someone wanted us to believe the Ashfords were involved. Or unless—" He turned to the butler, who looked ready to faint. "You said a man claiming to be Thomas Ashford appeared 5 years ago. Describe him, young sir." "Perhaps 30 years of age, tall, dark-haired. He had a scar across his left cheek, here." The butler traced a line from his cheekbone to his jaw. "And his eyes. They were filled with such hatred, sir. Such terrible, burning hatred. And you're certain you never saw him again after those 3 days?" "I am certain I never saw him at the gates again, sir, but—" The butler's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "But several times over the years, I had the sensation of being watched, of shadows moving where no shadows should be." Sir Alister felt it too. He became increasingly paranoid, refused to sleep in the same room 2 nights running, installed locks on every door. He was convinced someone had infiltrated the house. Holmes' expression grew grim. "Because someone had. The question is whether they're still here, or whether this severed hand belongs to them." He held up the ring to the candlelight. "We need to find the body this came from. It must be somewhere in the manor. A corpse cannot simply disappear, especially in a house this size with a storm preventing anyone from leaving." "The cellar," Colonel Hargrave said abruptly. "When I did my security assessment, I noted that portions of the cellar were blocked off. Sir Alister claimed they were unsafe, but I always wondered—" "Then that is where we begin." Holmes turned to the remaining staff. "Butler, gather every able-bodied servant in this house. We need lights, we need tools, and we need to conduct a systematic search. Watson, you'll come with me. The rest of you—" A clock somewhere in the house began to strike. 1, 2, 3, 11 chimes, each one resonating through the manor like a funeral bell. The 11th hour had arrived, and as the final chime faded, a scream erupted from somewhere above them, a long, agonized shriek that ended with a sickening thud. They raced back through the corridors and up the stairs following the sound. On the 3rd floor at the far end of the east wing, they found another door standing open. Inside, the room was small and spartanly furnished, clearly servants' quarters. But it was the window that drew their horrified attention. It stood open, curtains billowing inward with the wind and snow. And on the floor below the window, sprawled in a spreading pool of blood, lay the body of the butler's assistant, a young man Watson had seen briefly when they arrived. But he hadn't fallen. He had been stabbed repeatedly, the knife still protruding from between his shoulder blades. And clutched in his stiffening hand was another card, identical to the others. Holmes pulled it free and read aloud. "The second stroke has fallen. 10 remain. The innocent blood cries out for justice, and justice will be served." 10? Lady Eveline's voice shook. 10 what? 10 hours? 10 victims? Holmes's face was grave as he looked at each of them in turn. Watson, Lady Eveline, Colonel Hargrave, Mr. Crow, Miss Wren, the butler, and the handful of remaining servants who had gathered in the doorway. 10 people, he said quietly. There are exactly 10 of us left alive in Ravenhurst Manor, and unless I can solve this puzzle before midnight, I fear that number will continue to decrease with each passing hour. The hidden letter, the body of the young servant, lay cold on the floor, a stark reminder that the killer was no longer content with symbolic gestures. This was murder, brutal and direct. Holmes examined the corpse with swift efficiency, his fingers checking for signs of struggle, his eyes noting every detail. Watson watched the doorway, acutely aware that somewhere in this house, a murderer moved freely among them. He knew his attacker, Holmes announced. See how he turned his back? There are no defensive wounds on his hands. He was stabbed from behind by someone he trusted enough to let approach. One of the servants, then? Colonel Hargrave suggested. Or one of us, Lady Evelyn said coldly. We must face facts, gentlemen. The killer is in this room, Miss Wren whimpered, pressing herself against the wall. Crow's face had gone gray as ash. The butler stood trembling, his elderly hands clasped before him. Holmes straightened, his expression unreadable. The killer wants us divided, suspicious of one another. That is precisely what we must not allow. He turned to Watson. Help me move the body to a secure location. The rest of you will remain together in the drawing room under the colonel's supervision. No one goes anywhere alone. They worked quickly, carrying the servant to an unused room and locking it. As they returned to the corridor, Holmes pulled Watson aside, his voice dropping to a whisper. Watson, I need you to watch them carefully. Observe who speaks to whom, who avoids eye contact, who seems most frightened, and who seems most controlled. The killer is performing for us, and performers always reveal themselves through small tells. And you? What will you be doing? Following a thread that Sir Alister left for us. His final words, the clock lies, the 12th stroke already passed. I need to understand what he meant. They gathered the remaining survivors in the drawing room. The fire had burned low, casting more shadows than light. Holmes positioned himself by the mantel, his hawk-like gaze sweeping over each face. We have less than an hour until midnight. In that time, I intend to unmask our killer, but I require complete honesty from each of you. Lady Ashcroft, you told us your husband died of heart failure. Was that the truth? She met his eyes steadily. The truth is more complicated. Mr. Holmes, he took his own life. Poison. The same poison, I believe. That killed Sir Alister tonight. And you never thought to mention this? Would you advertise your husband's suicide, Mr. Holmes? The shame of it destroyed what remained of our social standing. Holmes nodded slowly. Miss Wren, the fire that killed the family you served, you said the mother set it deliberately. How can you be certain? The governess's voice trembled, because she told me she would. The day before it happened, she looked at me with such empty eyes and said, The clock is counting down, Miss Wren. When it strikes 12, we shall all be free. I thought she meant midnight would bring a new year, a fresh start. Instead, it brought death, Holmes finished. Mr. Crow, when you painted the memorial portrait, did you interview survivors? Did anyone mention seeing something unusual that night? The artist's hands shook. One man, a foreman who escaped, said he saw someone in the building who shouldn't have been there. A young man, unfamiliar, near the experimental mechanism just before it exploded. But in the chaos, no one could identify him. Holmes' eyes gleamed. A saboteur, someone who deliberately caused the fire. Colonel, you investigated the incident. Did your report mention this? It did. But we found no evidence to support the claim. The military concluded it was accidental, and the matter was closed. Conveniently closed, Holmes murmured. Tell me, Colonel, what exactly was being tested that night? The colonel hesitated. A timing device for delayed detonation. Highly experimental. If it had worked, it would have revolutionized artillery warfare. And if someone wanted to prevent that revolution? If someone had reason to sabotage Britain's military advancement? Then they succeeded admirably, the colonel said bitterly. The prototype was destroyed, and all the plans burned with it. Holmes crossed to the window, staring out at the raging storm. When he spoke, his voice was distant. 12 years ago, 37 people died. Their deaths were ruled accidental. But what if they weren't? What if someone murdered them deliberately, and 3 men, Sir Alister, Lord Ashcroft, and Thomas Ashford, covered it up to protect their business interests and military contracts? The room fell silent. That would make them accomplices to mass murder, Watson said slowly. Precisely. And it would give someone, a survivor, a relative, someone who knew the truth, a powerful motive for revenge. Lady Eveline stood abruptly. If you're suggesting my husband was a murderer, I'm suggesting he was a coward who chose profit over truth, as were his partners. And now, 12 years later, someone has decided to exact justice. Holmes pulled the severed hand from his coat pocket, still wrapped in cloth. The signet ring caught the firelight. This ring belonged to Thomas Ashford. But Thomas Ashford died 12 years ago. So either he didn't die, or someone has taken his identity and his ring as a symbol. Watson, you examined this hand. How long has this person been dead? Watson unwrapped it carefully, studying the flesh. No more than 6 hours. Rigor mortis hasn't fully set in, so this person died this evening, possibly around the same time we arrived. The killer severed the hand and placed it in the clock as a message. Holmes' voice grew urgent. We need to find the rest of the body, now. A distant sound made them freeze. Footsteps running through the house above them. Then a woman's scream. That's one of the maids. The butler gasped. They rushed upstairs, Holmes leading. They found her in Sir Alister's study, the room with all the clocks. She stood pointing at the desk, unable to speak. There, laid out carefully among the papers, was a photograph, old, faded, showing a group of workers standing before the Ashford factory, and circled in red ink one face among many, a young man with dark hair and a scar across his left cheek. Beneath the photograph, a single word was written, revenge. Holmes snatched up the photograph, his eyes scanning every detail with fierce intensity. The image showed approximately 40 workers, all dressed in their factory uniforms, standing in neat rows before the imposing brick facade of the Ashford Clockworks. The date, Watson noted, pointing to faded writing at the bottom. December 30th, 1882, the day before the fire. And this man, Holmes tapped the circled face, was present in the building that night. Miss Wren, look closely. Is this the same scar you described on the man who called himself Thomas Ashford? The governess leaned in, squinting at the photograph, then nodded shakily. Yes, I'm certain of it. The same scar, the same dark eyes, but that would mean that this worker survived the fire, Holmes finished. Or perhaps he was never in the building when it burned. Perhaps he started the fire and fled, leaving his fellow workers to die. No. The butler stepped forward, his voice stronger than it had been all evening. I remember him now. His name was James Thorne. He was Sir Alister's personal assistant, trusted with the most delicate work. He disappeared the night of the fire, and everyone assumed he'd died with the others. But his body was never found. Lady Eveline's face had gone pale. Thorne. I knew that name once. My husband mentioned him. Said he was brilliant but unstable. There was some scandal, something about him being dismissed just days before the fire. Dismissed for what reason? Holmes demanded. I don't remember exactly. Something about theft, or perhaps it was insubordination. My husband was vague about it, which wasn't unusual. He rarely discussed business with me. Holmes began pacing, his movements sharp and agitated. So we have James Thorne, a skilled clockmaker dismissed days before the fire. A fire that kills 37 of his former colleagues and destroys his employer's business. He survives, disappears for 12 years, then returns claiming to be Thomas Ashford, one of the men who dismissed him. But why would he wait so long? Crowe asked. Why not strike immediately if he wanted revenge? Because he needed time, Watson suggested. Time to plan, to watch, to understand his enemy's movements. Or, Holmes said slowly, because something prevented him. Prison, perhaps, or military service, or simply distance. But 6 months ago, something changed. Something brought him back to finish what he started. A clock in the corner began to chime, a small, delicate piece that seemed almost apologetic in its timing, 11 or 30. 30. Minutes remained until midnight. Holmes spun toward the butler. You, said Sir Alister, kept records of the fire victims and their families. Where are those records? In his private safe, sir. In the bedroom. But only Sir Alister knew the combination. Show me. They moved as a group, no one willing to be left alone. Sir Alister's bedroom was austere, almost monastic in its simplicity. The safe was set into the wall behind a painting of a clock tower, appropriately symbolic. Holmes examined it briefly, then smiled. Watson, what was the date of the fire? December 31st, 1882. Holmes spun the dial, 311282. The safe clicked open. Inside were ledgers, letters, photographs, and a leather journal. Holmes pulled out the journal first, flipping through pages of meticulous handwriting. His finger stopped on an entry dated 6 months prior. "Listen to this," he said, reading aloud. "He has returned. I saw him today in the village, watching me from across the street. James Thorne, alive after all these years, he has changed, harder, older, filled with a hatred that burns like cold fire. I know why he has come. He wants the truth and he wants blood. I cannot give him the former without destroying innocent lives, and I will not give him the latter without a fight. But I am dying and my time grows short. Perhaps it is fitting that he should be the instrument of my end. Perhaps it is justice." The room fell silent except for the ever-present ticking of clocks. Sir Alistair knew, Miss Wren whispered. He knew his killer and did nothing to stop him. He did more than nothing, Holmes corrected. He invited him in. He orchestrated this entire evening as a stage for his own murder. But why? Why invite the rest of you? Why involve me? He continued reading. "I have decided to gather them all, everyone whose life was touched by that terrible night. Lady Ashcroft, who lost her husband to guilt. Colonel Hargrave, whose military career ended with the project's failure. Nathaniel Crowe, whose art commemorates our victims. Claudia Wren, who lost her charges to the ripple effects of our crime. And Sherlock Holmes, who alone might piece together the truth from the fragments I leave behind." Holmes looked up, his gray eyes intense. Sir Alistair was creating a confession, not in words, but in evidence. He wanted someone to understand what really happened that night. He pulled out another document, an official report, yellowed with age. As he read, his expression grew darker. "Good God, Watson, look at this. It's an inspector's report from the day after the fire. It states that the explosion originated not from the experimental device, but from the building's gas lines. Someone had deliberately damaged the pipes and set a delayed ignition mechanism. Sabotage," Colonel Hargrave breathed. "We were right. But here's the crucial detail," Holmes continued. The inspector noted that only someone with intimate knowledge of both the building's layout and advanced clockwork mechanisms could have constructed such a device. He recommended investigating all skilled employees, but the report was never filed officially. It was suppressed. By whom? Watson asked. Holmes held up a letter clipped to the report. It bore a military seal by Colonel Marcus Hargrave's commanding officer. "On grounds of national security," the colonel's face flushed. "That wasn't my decision, Holmes. The military wanted the entire incident buried. Too many questions about why we were testing experimental weapons in a civilian factory. So James Thorne sabotaged the building, killed 37 people, and the military helped cover it up to protect their secrets." Holmes's voice was cold. "And the 3 factory owners, Ravenshaw, Ashcroft, and Ashford, accepted the cover-up because it protected them from liability. But that means," Lady Eveline said slowly, "that Sir Alistair wasn't just guilty of cowardice, he was an accomplice to covering up mass murder. Yes. And James Thorne has spent 12 years planning his revenge against everyone involved in that cover-up." A sudden thought struck Watson. "Holmes, if Thorne is methodically killing everyone connected to the cover-up, then we're not his targets. We're witnesses. He wants us to see justice being done." "Precisely, Watson." "Which means..." The lights went out again, plunging them into darkness, but this time they were prepared. Watson had his matches ready, and within seconds, candles were lit, and in their flickering light, they saw something that hadn't been there moments before. Written on the mirror in what appeared to be blood. A message: 11 years in hell, 11 hours of terror, 1 hour remains. At midnight, the final truth. Beneath it, an arrow pointed downward, toward the cellar. The descent into truth. The cellar door stood at the end of a narrow corridor, its iron handle cold as ice. Holmes tested it carefully, unlocked. Beyond lay a darkness so complete it seemed almost solid, pressing against them like a physical force. "We should wait for reinforcements," Colonel Hargrave suggested. Though his voice lacked conviction. "There are no reinforcements, Colonel. Only us, and a killer who has been planning this night for 12 years. Holmes took a candle and started down the stone steps. "Stay close. Watson, you're with me. The rest of you remain here and guard the door." You expect us to simply wait while you—" Lady Eveline began. "I expect you to survive, Lady Ashcroft. If we don't return in 10 minutes, barricade yourselves in the drawing room until dawn." Watson followed Holmes down into the earth. The stairs were steep and worn, the air growing colder with each step. Their candles cast grotesque shadows on the rough stone walls. Somewhere below, water dripped with metronomic persistence. The cellar was vast, divided into chambers by crumbling brick arches. Crates and furniture lay shrouded in dust, forgotten relics of the manor's better days. But Holmes moved with purpose, following some invisible trail only he could perceive. "There," he whispered, pointing. In the far corner, a newer wall had been constructed, brick and mortar, that didn't match the ancient stonework around it. And at its base, a gap just wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Holmes knelt, examining the opening. Fresh mortar dust. "Someone has been using this passage recently." He looked back at Watson. "Ready?" They crawled through into a hidden chamber beyond. What they found made Watson's blood run cold. It was a workshop, but not Sir Alister's. This was newer, temporary, constructed within the last few months. A table held tools, clock mechanisms, wires, chemicals. On the wall hung a map of the manor with rooms marked and times noted. And in the center of the room stood a grandfather clock, identical to the one in Sir Alister's workshop, but this clock's face had been modified. Instead of numbers, it bore 12 names: Sir Alister Ravenshaw, Lord Edmund Ashcroft, Thomas Ashford, Colonel Marcus Hargrave, and 8 others Watson didn't recognize, presumably servants, workers, officials connected to the cover-up. The first 3 names had been crossed out in red. "A death list," Watson breathed. "Holmes, this is evidence of premeditation. James Thorne has been living beneath the manor for months, planning every detail." Holmes moved to the table, examining papers scattered across its surface. "Look at this. Schedules, guard rotations, Sir Alister's medical appointments. Thorne has been watching everything." Watson noticed something else. A bedroll in the corner, a small stove, provisions. Someone had been living here, but where is he now? "Where's Thorne?" Holmes didn't answer. He was staring at a photograph pinned to the wall, the same group photo from Sir Alister's study, but this copy had been annotated. Each face bore a note. New, but said nothing. Took bribes to stay silent. Falsified evidence. Destroyed inspector's report. And beside James Thorne's own circled face, in handwriting that trembled with rage, innocent, blamed, destroyed. "Watson, I've been wrong," Holmes said quietly. James Thorne didn't start the fire. He was framed for it. Before Watson could respond, a sound echoed through the cellar, footsteps above them, running, then screams. They scrambled back through the gap and up the stairs. In the corridor, they found chaos. Miss Wren was sobbing hysterically. Crow stood frozen, his face ashen. The butler was on his knees, and Colonel Hargrave lay on the floor, a knife protruding from his chest, his eyes wide and unseeing. Lady Eveline stood over him, her hands covered in blood. "He attacked me," she gasped. "He came at me with the knife, and I turned it on him. Self-defense. It was self-defense." Holmes knelt by the colonel's body, examining the wound with clinical precision. This entered from the front at an upward angle, consistent with a shorter person stabbing a taller one during a struggle. He looked up at Lady Eveline. "Tell me exactly what happened." Her story came in gasps. The colonel had grown agitated, accused her of being Thorne's accomplice, pulled a knife from his coat. She'd fought back, the blade had turned, and then, where did the knife come from? Holmes asked, his coat pocket. "He drew it when he accused me." Holmes stood and searched the colonel's body. No sheath, no indication he'd been carrying a knife. He turned to the others. "Did any of you see the colonel carrying a weapon?" They all shook their heads. Then someone placed it in his hand after he was already dying. "Lady Ashcroft, you've just killed an innocent man." Her face crumpled. No, that's not. He attacked me." He was already stabbed, probably from behind like the servant. "Someone positioned him to fall toward you, placed the knife, and let you believe you were defending yourself." Holmes's voice was hard. "You've been manipulated into becoming a killer." A clock began to chime. Not one clock, all of them. Every timepiece in the house struck midnight simultaneously, a cacophony of bells and chimes that seemed to shake the very walls. 12 strokes. The 12th hour had arrived. As the final chime faded, a voice echoed through the corridor. Male, cold, filled with years of suppressed rage. The 12th stroke has fallen. Now you will know the truth. A figure emerged from the shadows at the corridor's end. Tall, dark-haired, with a scar across his left cheek. But his face wasn't filled with hatred. It was filled with exhausted sorrow. James Thorne had finally revealed himself 12 years ago, he said, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. I discovered that the experimental device was flawed. I reported it to Sir Alistair, begged him to stop the test. He dismissed me instead, called me a fool and a coward. That night, I broke into the factory to sabotage the device myself, to prevent the disaster I knew was coming. He stepped closer, and Watson saw tears on his scarred face. But I was too late. Someone had already sabotaged the gas lines. The building exploded while I was still inside. I barely escaped with my life. And when I tried to tell the truth, they blamed me. Called me the saboteur. Destroyed my life? Holmes nodded slowly. And so you've spent 12 years hunting the real saboteur. That's what this has all been about. Not revenge, justice. Thorne's laugh was bitter. Justice? There is no justice, Mr. Holmes. Only truth. And the truth is that the man who actually destroyed that factory, who murdered 37 innocent people, has been living in comfort while I rotted in prison for his crime. Then tell us, Holmes said softly. Who was it? Who killed them? Thorne smiled, a terrible broken smile. You already know, Mr. Holmes. You've known since you found the evidence in the cellar. The real killer is a gunshot cracked through the air. James Thorne's eyes widened in shock. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest, then collapsed. Behind where he'd been standing, holding a smoking pistol, stood the last person any of them had suspected. The butler stood with the gun steady in his trembling hands, his elderly face transformed by cold resolve. The mask of servility had fallen away, revealing something far darker beneath. Forgive me, Mr. Holmes, he said quietly, but some truths must remain buried. Holmes moved with lightning speed, knocking the pistol from the old man's hand before he could fire again. Watson rushed to Thorne's side, pressing his hands against the wound, but even as he worked, he knew it was futile. The bullet had pierced the lung. Thorne's lips moved, blood bubbling at the corners of his mouth. Tell them I tried to save them. And then he was gone. Holmes stood over the butler, who had collapsed to his knees, all fight drained from him. How long have you worked for Sir Alistair? 15 years, you said. But that's a lie, isn't it? You've been here much longer? Since before the factory was even built, the old man nodded slowly. 30 years. I was Sir Alistair's father's servant first. I watched young Alistair grow up. I was there when he built his business, when he formed his partnership. And you were there the night of the fire. Yes. The word was barely a whisper. I was there. Holmes crouched beside him, his voice gentler now. Tell us what really happened that night. The truth that Sir Alistair died to reveal. The truth that James Thorne spent 12 years trying to expose. The butler's eyes were distant, seeing ghosts. The experimental device worked perfectly. That was the problem. The military wanted it, but others, foreign powers, wanted it more. They offered Mr. Thomas Ashford a fortune to destroy it. And Ashford was drowning in gambling debts. He agreed, Lady Evelyn gasped. Thomas Ashford sabotaged his own factory? He planted the explosives himself, set them to detonate at midnight. But he made a mistake. He didn't realize the night shift would be working late to complete the military's order. When he discovered workers were still inside, he tried to stop it. That's when young Thorne found him, trying to dismantle the device. The butler's voice grew hoarse with remembered horror. They fought. Ashford knocked Thorne unconscious and fled. The explosion happened at exactly 12 strokes of midnight. 37 people died instantly, and afterward, Holmes pressed. Sir Alistair and Lord Ashcroft discovered what Thomas had done. They were horrified, but they were also terrified of scandal. The military was already suspicious. If the truth came out, that one of the owners had sold them out to foreign powers, they would all be ruined, possibly tried for treason. So they covered it up, Watson said, his voice thick with disgust. They blamed an innocent man. They blamed James Thorne, yes? He'd been fired. He had access to the building. He'd been found unconscious in the wreckage. The evidence was circumstantial, but convincing. Thorne was arrested and convicted of negligent manslaughter. He served 10 years, and Thomas Ashford killed himself 6 months later. The guilt destroyed him. But before he died, he told me everything. Made me promise to keep the secret, to protect Sir Alister and Lord Ashcroft. Holmes stood, his face carved from stone. But you didn't keep that promise, did you? You're the one who sent the threatening letters. You arranged this gathering. You killed Sir Alister. No. The butler looked up with desperate eyes. I didn't kill him. I only told him that Thorne had been released from prison and was coming. Sir Alister chose to drink the poison himself. He wanted to confess, wanted to make amends. But he was a coward to the end. He couldn't face speaking the truth aloud, so he orchestrated this elaborate puzzle, hoping you would solve it for him. And the servant I found murdered, the colonel, Thorne killed them. He'd been living in the cellar for months, growing madder with each passing day. I tried to stop him, but he was beyond reason. He wanted everyone connected to the cover-up dead. Holmes pulled out the severed hand, still wrapped in cloth. And whose hand is this? The butler's face crumpled. Thomas Ashford's. I preserved his body in the sealed portion of the cellar all these years. Couldn't bear to bury him with proper rites, knowing what he'd done. Thorne found it when he broke in. He cut off the hand and placed it in the clock as a message. Even the dead cannot escape judgment. Watson felt sick. 12 years of lies built upon a foundation of cowardice and greed. 37 innocent lives, and all the destruction that followed. The families destroyed, the children orphaned, the survivors left to carry unbearable guilt. Holmes turned to Lady Eveline, who stood pale and shaking. Your husband knew the truth. That's why he killed himself. Not from business failure, but from moral failure. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I found his confession letter after he died. He'd written it all out, every detail. I burned it. I couldn't bear for anyone to know. And you, Miss Wren? The family you served, did you know they were connected to the fire? Not until tonight. Mr. Hargrove never spoke of it. But now I understand why his wife went mad. She must have known, must have blamed herself somehow for surviving when so many others died. Holmes surveyed them all, the guilty, the innocent, the complicit, the ignorant, all mixed together in tragedy's web. The 12th stroke of death, he said quietly. Sir Alister meant it literally. At the 12th stroke of midnight on New Year's Eve, 12 years after the original crime, the final truth would be revealed. He orchestrated his own death as a confession, knowing that I would unravel what he was too cowardly to speak. He picked up the photograph of the factory workers, studying James Thorne's face. This man spent 10 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. When he was released, he discovered that the truth had been suppressed, that the guilty had escaped justice. He devoted his remaining years to revenge, and in the end, he was murdered by the only person who knew the complete truth, the man who had kept the secret for 12 years. The butler bowed his head. What will you do with me, Mr. Holmes? Holmes was silent for a long moment. Outside, the storm was finally breaking. Through the windows, the first gray light of dawn was visible. I will do what Sir Alister should have done 12 years ago. I will tell the truth, all of it. The military cover-up, Thomas Ashford's treachery, the false conviction of James Thorne. You will confess to murdering Thorne tonight. Lady Ashcroft will face charges for the colonel's death, though I suspect a sympathetic jury will find extenuating circumstances. He turned to face them all. And the rest of you will live with the knowledge that your silence enabled this tragedy, that your fear of scandal mattered more than justice for 37 murdered workers. But the colonel was innocent, Crowe protested. He was just following orders. No one is innocent, Holmes said coldly. You all knew pieces of the truth. You all chose to look away. That is its own form of guilt. As dawn fully broke, Inspector Lestrade finally arrived, having fought through the storm-damaged roads. Holmes gave him a complete report, laying out the evidence with meticulous precision. The butler was arrested. Lady Eveline was taken into custody. The bodies were removed: Sir Alister, James Thorne, the murdered servants, Colonel Hargrave, and the long-preserved corpse of Thomas Ashford. Watson stood beside Holmes as they watched the police work. Both men exhausted beyond measure. "Holmes," Watson said quietly, "do you think Sir Alister found any peace in the end?" Knowing that the truth would finally be told, Holmes stared at the grandfather clock in the entrance hall, now silent and still, its mechanism broken by the hand that had been thrust into its gears. Peace? No, Watson. Sir Alister Ravenshaw died as he lived, trapped by time, haunted by the 12th stroke that marked the moment when his cowardice sealed the fate of 37 innocent souls. There is no peace in such a death, only the cold comfort of knowing that lies, however carefully constructed, eventually crumble before truth's patient persistence. He turned away from the manor, pulling his coat tight against the morning cold. "Come, Watson. We've lingered too long in this house of frozen time. Let us return to London, to the living, and leave the dead to their accounting." As they departed Ravenhurst Manor, the broken clock remained behind, a monument to secrets kept too long, to justice delayed, and to the terrible price of silence. The 12th stroke had finally fallen, and in its echo, truth had been revealed at last. The end. You've been watching the Mystery Ledger, where every enigma leaves a trace.